Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to 10 to Life. My name is Elise, and I'm here with you today to talk with you about another true crime case. So I hope you are all doing well. I hope you are ready and cozy, either cuddled up on your couch, or maybe, I think a lot of you clean while you listen to this, so maybe you're scrubbing your toilet. I don't know. Whatever it is you're doing, I hope you're ready to hear this case with me today. Now, let me just kind of start by saying this. I feel like for years, our perception of killers has really been shaped by popular movies and TV shows, kind of depicting them as these big, dark, and scary individuals like Jason or Michael Myers. These fictional characters have kind of influenced how we envision real-life killers to be. So then, when someone who doesn't fit this mold commits a murder, it can be even more shocking. So when a heinous murder took place in Ohio, the police found themselves very perplexed, as the victim was one of the most vulnerable and innocent members of the community. With no clear motive, they meticulously examined the evidence and the clues, and the evidence started pointing towards a very unlikely suspect that nobody would typically suspect at all. So let's get right into it, guys. Okay, guys, do you have trouble sleeping or trouble staying asleep? Because I do, and I have for as long as I can remember. Well, correction, up until about a year ago, which is when my husband introduced me to Beam Dream Tea. Now, you might have heard me talk about it before, but if you haven't, let me tell you. Dream is this luxurious dessert tasting tea that is filled with the highest quality sleep promoting ingredients. So my go-to flavor is sea salt caramel because it literally tastes like hot chocolate, which is so good. But they also have chocolate peanut butter, a cinnamon cocoa, mint chip. I mean, the list of flavors goes on. Which, let me also just say this, guys, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here. What New Year's resolutions are you prioritizing? And how can good sleep with Dream help you achieve them? Because for me, I know I am not waking up and working out or focusing on better habits if I'm dead tired. I'm human, I'm not Superman, and I need sleep in order to be my best self, especially if I'm going to start doing my goals for the year that I have set for myself. Now, I also wear a sleep tracking Oura ring, and my scores when I started drinking this went from the 60s to the literal mid-90s. All with Beam. It is honestly unbelievable. And we all know that better sleep means more energy, better mood, better skin, all of the things. Plus, at just 15 calories and 0 added sugar, it's a no-brainer for me because it tastes like literal dessert. I love that Dream has high-quality sleep ingredients that leave me with 0 grogginess the next day, which all these other sleep aids that I've tried before always leave me kind of just walking like a zombie. Not with Beam. And in a clinical study, 93% of participants reported that Dream helped them get a better night's sleep and wake up feeling more refreshed. And I am so beyond excited to officially announce that Beam is now an official partner of this channel for 2024, which just makes me so happy because I just absolutely love them. And now I get to share my sleep secrets with you and hook you guys up with sweet deals all year long. So click the link below or scan the QR code and use code 10TOLIFE to get up to 35% off. So sweet dreams, 10 to lifers, thank me later. Named after her mother, Margaret Mary Frick was born on September 15, 1919. She was the oldest girl of 4 siblings, with 1 older brother and 2 younger sisters, and she was raised in her hometown of Akron, Ohio. Now, Margaret would live in the Akron area her entire life, and she made herself known for her independent and very opinionated nature. When she was in her 20s, she met a man named Donald Douglas, and the two of them instantly fell in love. Now, while Donald was quiet and reserved, Margaret was outgoing and sociable, but they seemed to complement one another perfectly, just perfectly. So the couple ended up going on to marry right after World War II on November 1st, 1958. and then they moved to a house in Wadsworth, Ohio. Now, Wadsworth is a relatively small suburban just 20 minutes outside of Akron. As of 2023, the population is just under 25,000 people. But when Margaret and Donald Douglas first moved there, it was a much smaller town, and they really enjoyed the small, quiet, and tight-knit community. The people in the town were also very kind and neighborly, and they were always looking out for each other. So Margaret and Donald especially loved the community aspect because the couple had decided not to have any children of their own. So whether it be their neighbor or their friends or any of their nieces and nephews, Margaret and Douglas always had people kind of coming by, checking in on them, and keeping them company. They also loved to travel and loved to attend baseball games together, and they were both huge fans of the Cleveland Indians. However, unfortunately, after a very long and happy marriage, in the year 2000, Donald passed away at the age of 80 years old. This was devastating to Margaret because Donald had been her partner and best friend for over 40 years. But Margaret tried to keep her life as normal as she could, and she never slowed down. She continued living her life and living in the same house and just kind of living like she normally would. She liked to be outside, she liked to spend time in the garden, and overall she really just maintained her independence. Margaret knew all of the kids in the neighborhood too, and was kind of known as the quintessential loving, warm, and sweet older lady. Everybody's town grandma, if that makes sense. She also felt safe and cared for in this small town. In fact, she felt so safe that she hardly ever locked her door, like most people in the area. The neighborhood had always been safe, and the crime rate was always so low that it really never seemed necessary. By 2018, Margaret often spoke about how proud she was to be 98 years old and still extremely independent. She had now been living alone for almost 20 years by this point, and she paid her own bills, did most of her daily tasks on her own. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. She also could not wait to turn 100, and her entire family never doubted that she would make it to that milestone. Now, even though she could do most things, she did employ the help of her niece and nephew, Howard Jr. and Cindy Leisure. The two of them lived about 40 minutes away from Margaret, but they would pop in from time to help her with things around the house like yard work, home maintenance, and just to make sure that she was okay. On April 9th, 2018, Howard called the police department though, because he was worried about Margaret. A friend of hers said that she hadn't seen her in a while, and Howard hadn't heard from her in a few days either. He had asked a friend to go over the previous day to check on her, but when the friend arrived at Margaret's house, he knocked, but no one came to the door. He looked around the house and into the windows, but he couldn't see Margaret anywhere. And he also noticed that the newspapers from the past few days were all still on the porch. So Howard called the police and asked if they could go and do a wellness check on his Aunt Margaret. The police went over to her house and they knocked, and they received the same results. There was no answer. So they figured that maybe she had fallen. But then, after entering her house, they couldn't find Margaret anywhere. They yelled her name several times but got no response. So they started searching the neighborhood, asking neighbors if they had seen Margaret, but the police still didn't have any luck. They contacted hospitals, friends, and looked in places that Margaret often went to, but there didn't seem to be any trace of her. So that night, Howard and Cindy arrived to the local police department, and they went to Margaret's home to help the police. The police were hoping that Howard and Cindy would be able to notice anything different about Margaret's house, something out of the ordinary. Since they saw Margaret often, they would know what items should be missing from the home if she left willingly. Specifically, Howard and Cindy were looking for a pair of shoes and Margaret's red wallet. You see, Margaret always wore the same shoes when she left the house. So if she had left the home on her own, the shoes should have been gone. So they all searched the house and they didn't find anything too alarming. The house was clean and it was organized as usual, and her red wallet and shoes were gone. So after searching the rest of the house, Howard went to go look in the front closet because Margaret's shoes were sometimes kept there. And when he opened the door, he saw her shoe lying on the floor underneath a pile of clothing. He went to pick it up, but when he did, he picked up more than just the shoe, because to his horror, a cold and clammy foot was still attached. Tragically, beneath that pile of clothing in her front closet, Margaret's body was found. Upon immediate investigation and examination of the body, investigators noted a few key things. Margaret's underwear was torn, her nightgown was completely unbuttoned, and her bra was pulled up. Now, this was obviously an immediate red flag, leading investigators to believe that this could have been a sexually motivated murder. They also noted that there seemed to be a lot of trauma to her neck area, but there weren't any visible ligature marks. So this made them think that Margaret could have been killed by manual strangulation. And basically, whoever did this likely strangled Margaret to death using their bare hands. They also noticed that blood had pooled around her head with the way that her body had been placed, with her head being the lowest part. Now, this is known as lividity, and after someone dies, since their heart is no longer pumping blood, gravity gradually pulls all of the blood to the lowest point of the body. Because the blood pooled in one area, it appeared that she had actually been lying in that closet for a few days. So investigators started scouring Margaret's house looking for any potential evidence. The fact that Margaret's wallet was missing made the investigators think that the attack may have started from a burglary and then escalated from there. Well, they found human fluids, semen, on Margaret's body and in other areas of the house, which confirmed to the police that there had, in fact, been a sexual assault in this house, in this crime, which is horrible to think about with Margaret being such a sweet older lady. They also noted that there was an open jar of jelly that seemed to be used as some sort of lubricant to commit this sexual assault on Margaret. Gross, right? Now, they couldn't find any fingerprints or other DNA, but they did find a plastic disposable glove in Margaret's yard. Hoping there would be something helpful on the glove, investigators took it into evidence, and it was quickly found that Margaret's DNA was on the outside of the glove, while an unknown person's DNA was on the inside. Now, as is typical in crimes like this, Howard and Cindy were investigators' very first suspects because they were the ones who helped Margaret, knew her schedule, knew what she did on a day-to-day basis. However, after thoroughly questioning the two and viewing their cell phone records, the police confirmed that neither Howard or Cindy could have committed this crime. But then who would want to do something so terrible to a sweet and innocent older lady? Investigators asked Cindy and Howard if there was anyone who would have any sort of financial gain from murdering Margaret, but they said no. She didn't even have a will written out. Margaret didn't have any problems or bad blood with anyone, so they were really at a complete loss as to who could have done this to her. Trying to think of possibilities, Cindy and Howard told investigators about a man named David, who would often help Margaret when no one else was around. David was Margaret's old neighbor, and he would occasionally check on her, take out her trash, get her mail, and just help her with general things around the house if she needed it. So investigators obtained David's cell phone number, and they tried calling him numerous times, but he never answered. They left messages, but they never heard back from him either. And the lack of communication from David started making police suspicious. During the investigation, as police were searching through Margaret's home, they noticed a strange man standing outside of the house, smoking a cigarette, and just watching as police went in and out of the house. He was asking questions about what was going on, but also making comments about the crime that had not been released to the public yet. Somehow this man knew where and how Margaret was found, which made the police even more suspicious, right? So especially because it isn't uncommon for a criminal to return to the scene of the crime or insert themselves into investigations, this was something that stuck out to police. Sometimes criminals attend vigils, funerals, or even give tips to the police as well. So police were feeling more and more off about this man, and when they asked him who he was, they discovered that this was actually the man that they had been searching for, David. Now, because they were suspicious of David, investigators started asking other neighbors about him as well. One recalled seeing him drive through the neighborhood a few times after Margaret's body was found, and another said that David made a comment to them about how he was nervous because his fingerprints were going to be all over the house. David then made another strange move by going on the news and talking about Margaret's death. He talked about how sad he was, but the police felt that if his sadness was genuine, he would not be going on the news. So to police, this was just another instance of David really trying to insert himself into the investigation. So on April 11th, 2 days after Margaret's body was found, David was brought into the station for questioning. And at the time, he was the #1 person of interest in this case. David said that he loved Margaret and told them that how he would help with basic chores around the house. And he said that on Sunday, April 8th, he went to Margaret's house but couldn't find her anywhere. He was becoming worried and thought that maybe Margaret had fallen upstairs while changing and was just too shy to yell out to him. He didn't want to risk violating her privacy though, so he just called another neighbor named Jan to check upstairs. She didn't find Margaret either though, so they both eventually left. Now, to the police, this story seemed a little bit off, because if you really thought that your elderly neighbor was in trouble, maybe even injured, would you really just pause, call someone else, and wait for them to go check on her? At that point, whether she was changing or not shouldn't matter, especially since he claimed to love her. So to police, if David really thought that something had happened to Margaret, he would have immediately gone upstairs to check regardless. Then David started making some really strange comments, like how good Margaret looked, and that she had been really good looking when she was younger. And investigators were very weirded out by this, because who makes comments about someone like that after they were just murdered? So all of this was making David look even more sketchy. So they asked for a cell phone, but he said he left it at home. And this again set off alarm bells to investigators, as people nowadays are usually dependent on their cell phones and are unlikely to ever leave their house without it. However, David was more than happy to provide a DNA sample to the police. If they said that they needed one, he was open to it. So investigators then took some samples from David and got a subpoena to search his phone. Now, to their surprise, the evidence collected actually pointed to David likely not being the one to hurt Margaret. And his DNA further proved this, as he was not a match for the DNA that was found inside of the glove. So David was then released and no longer a suspect. Although he had been acting strange, he ended up being genuinely concerned for Margaret. And he might have been a little bit weird, but he cared for Margaret and he wanted to know what had happened to her. So unfortunately, this left police back at square one with even more questions on how to move forward with this case. So they decided to look at other crimes in the area to see if there was anything that could possibly be related or similar to Margaret's murder. And they started noticing that there was a string of petty crimes happening in the vicinity of Margaret's house. And police figured that the person or persons committing these crimes might have a link to Margaret's murder, since the crime rate in the area was normally so very low. Specifically, they were interested in a carjacking that occurred near Margaret's home. A man named Paul said that he had been driving along when he noticed a young man, maybe 19 or 20 years old, limping and walking up the street. So Paul said that he was trying to be a nice guy and asked this young man if he needed help. He got out of the car to help this man, but when he did, the young man slid into the driver's seat, locked the car doors, and then drove off. The car was eventually found not far from the same area where it was taken. So police noted that there were many cameras in the area, and they wanted to obtain the surveillance footage, especially because there were some details in Paul's story that weren't adding up to them at all. The footage from one of the cameras showed a man approaching Paul's car, but he wasn't limping, and for the most part, the footage didn't match anything Paul said had happened. So investigators decided to bring him in for a second round of questioning. And this time, Paul seemed really nervous. He confessed that he actually met this young man on Grindr, which is a social media app used by a lot of people in the LGBTQ plus community, and Paul had said that they were meeting up for sexual purposes, and that they started going at it in Paul's car, if you know what I mean. But in the middle of it, apparently, the younger man suddenly got really angry, and out of nowhere, he snapped, and he made Paul get out of the car, he locked the doors, and then drove off. Now, Paul said he initially didn't tell the police what had happened because he was so embarrassed about the Grindr situation. He worked for a church, and he didn't want it to be known that he was sleeping with other men. Paul had heard about Margaret's death on the news, but also didn't know her, and had no ties to the area. So unfortunately, after his initial interrogation, he became nervous and he deleted his Grindr account and the app completely from his phone. So Paul couldn't supply the police with any information about the young man other than he had a smooth complexion and blue eyes. Due to this, the police unfortunately couldn't obtain any other information about this man that Paul had met. 4 days after the discovery of Margaret's body, there were multiple calls to the police about 2 young boys running around late at night and spending time in various parking lots. A little while later, there were calls about a break-in at a construction site. This construction site had a trailer that had been broken into, and someone had left their phone inside. Investigators were able to unlock the phone, and they discovered that the phone belonged to a young man named Zach. Now, police were actually pretty familiar with Zach, as he had been in trouble with the police many times before for things like burglary and theft. and they eventually found Zach sleeping in his car at school and then brought him in for questioning. When they brought him in, though, they immediately noticed that Zach had cuts all along his legs, and investigators thought that they looked like they could be defensive wounds. So when they started questioning Zach, he admitted to theft, but he said that he had no idea about Margaret's murder. He said he heard about it on the news, but he had no personal knowledge of the crime. However, Zach did mention that a friend was with him at the construction site, and his friend's name was Gavin Ramsey. And Zach claimed that breaking into and stealing from the construction site had been Gavin's idea all along. Zach insisted that whenever he and Gavin were together, Zach would just sit back and watch while Gavin did all of the stealing. Zach insisted that all of the thefts were Gavin's fault, not his. So then, Gavin was brought into the station for questioning. But being that he was only 17 years old at the time, his mom accompanied him. Now, police were also familiar with Gavin, as he had also been in trouble before. So 2 investigators asked Gavin about the trailer, about the construction site, and the other instances of theft in the area. And surprisingly, he immediately confessed and claimed that he did those things because he liked the adrenaline rush that came along with it. He says he didn't even really care about the money, he just cared about that adrenaline rush. And since he was being so honest, they wanted to see what else he would confess to. So they started asking him about the carjacking with Paul. But at this point, Gavin suddenly became very quiet and asked to speak to the main detective alone. So his mom and the other detective left the room. Once they were alone, Gavin admitted to stealing Paul's car. He said that he would often meet with men on Grindr, but was very hesitant to talk about what he would do with them physically. He said he would just meet with the men to steal from them, and that he felt that it was payback for them wanting to have sex with other men. Now, from this conversation, the investigator then came right out and asked Gavin if he killed Margaret Douglas. But of course, Gavin said no. But the investigators felt that something wasn't quite right about Gavin, and they worried about him running away and not being able to get a hold of him again. And even though he admitted to theft by minors was dealt with in juvenile court. But because they felt like there was more to his story since he was a minor, they asked Gavin's mom if they could have his phone before they left. So she consented, claiming, "It is what it is. Whatever they find, I pray to God there's nothing too horrible in there." But unfortunately, her prayers would not come true, as what they found in his phone was absolutely horrific, horrifying, and worse than they could have ever expected. Police were able to find a hidden file on Gavin's phone that was titled Dark, and the password for this file was murder. In this file were photos and videos from the early morning hours of April 6th, 2018, and they detailed what took place that night. There was a very creepy video of Gavin entering Margaret's home and peeking around the corner of a wall, watching her as she slept on the couch. At one point, Margaret was startled, and it was like she suddenly became aware that someone was in her house. She had a very chilling look on her face as what was going on began to dawn on her. While the video or photos never showed Gavin's face, though, you do occasionally see a hand wearing a glove, like the glove that was found in Margaret's yard. There weren't any pictures of the murder itself, but there were several disturbing pictures and videos of the aftermath, like Gavin taking off her clothing, using her lifeless hands to pleasure himself, placing her body in sexual positions, and also putting his fingers inside of her. Just absolutely diabolical and disgusting. And the timestamps of the videos and the pictures showed that Gavin abused Margaret's body for over 2 hours. Investigators also noted that Gavin looked at the pictures and videos numerous times since they were taken on April 6th, probably getting off from what he did. Now, after seeing this, police immediately asked Gavin to come back to the station for another round of questioning. They were worried that he would try to flee, so they didn't want to make it seem like too big of a deal. And when he arrived, he was brought into a room and left alone for a little while. Well, cameras show Gavin breaking down and crying, and even sliding off his seat and onto the floor. When investigators entered the room, they didn't waste any time about asking him about Margaret. And Gavin actually lived just around the corner from Margaret and had spoken to her many times about possibly helping her around the house for some extra money. So he said that he entered the house in the early morning hours of April 6th because he wanted to get that adrenaline rush, To him, this felt like the biggest adrenaline rush that he could possibly get. So he entered the home through the unlocked door, and he watched Margaret for about 10 to 15 minutes before approaching her. He then pulled her body off the couch, climbing on top of her and strangling her with both of his hands. He said he wasn't sure what caused him to do this, but once he started, it was too late, and he could not stop. Now, Gavin, again, was hesitant in talking about the sexual nature of his crime. He said that he was in the house for hours, but that once he realized it was 4 a.m., he needed to leave. His mom apparently usually woke up around 5 a.m. to get ready for work, and Gavin had to be home when she woke up so that he wouldn't get in trouble for being out so late. So then he decided to place Margaret's body in the closet. He covered her with clothing, and then he left. He said that after the murder, he didn't really feel anything, that he just continued to smoke, drink, and steal like he always did. Just callous and cold. Now, with Gavin's admission, investigators were able to get a warrant to search his room. And in it, they found a bunch of plastic gloves, just like the one they found in Margaret's yard. They also found Margaret's red wallet and a journal that was written by Gavin with many, many disturbing entries. He wrote pages upon pages about serial killers, almost like he was preparing an extensive report on them, and he was particularly obsessed with Ted Bundy. He wrote that he was going to end up in prison for doing something bad, like committing a murder or sexually assaulting a girl, and he said that even though he knew it was wrong, he didn't feel bad about it. Gavin detailed a fantasy also of taking a random girl into the woods and violating her there. And then he also had a list of people that he planned to kill. Kind of gives Aiden Fucci vibes in a really weird, twisted way. Then, on January 18th, just a few months before Margaret's murder, Gavin wrote that he wanted to beat people until they couldn't breathe anymore, and that he wanted to know what it would feel like to stand over a dead body. As if all of the other evidence didn't make it apparent enough, these journal entries really solidified to investigators that Gavin was Margaret's killer. So he was arrested on April 16th, 2018. But what would cause a 17-year-old boy to want to do this? Well, let's talk a little bit about Gavin. Gavin Ramsey was born on March 23rd, 2001. He lived with his parents, his 3 brothers, and a grandma, and as a child, he was said to be very energetic, very caring, and a very helpful little boy. But then, in 2008, when he was just 7 years old, Gavin began displaying many concerning behaviors. He became almost uncontrollable at school, even causing his teacher to suggest that he should be evaluated for ADHD. He was prescribed Adderall, but didn't find much help from the medication, so he switched to another one. Now, both medications that he used are commonly used to treat ADHD, but unlike Adderall, this other medication isn't a stimulant. As a child, Gavin also was sexually assaulted by an older boy in the neighborhood, but his mom didn't want him to go through with a police interrogation, so they never reported it. However, in 2011, when he was 10 years old, she did start bringing him to see a therapist. During this year, Gavin brought an airsoft gun to school, and when it was found, he said that he brought it for safety, but never said who he was trying to protect himself from. Also, at this age, he had a fight with his father that left him so distressed that he tried to choke himself. After this, he began seeing a different psychiatrist, and in 2012, he stopped taking medication for ADHD altogether. So after Gavin stopped taking medication, that's when he began abusing drugs and alcohol. Then, when he was 15 years old, his friend was shot and his dad was diagnosed with leukemia. And his father's diagnosis reportedly had hit him very hard. And all of this apparently caused Gavin to really spiral, and he began getting into a lot of trouble. By 16, he was smoking a lot, he was having a 5th of alcohol a day, and he was taking Concerta that he would purchase from someone at school, which that's similar to Adderall because it's a stimulant and it's used to treat ADHD. He would purchase these items by stealing money from his parents or stealing the items themselves. But at one point, he did want to apparently try and make some extra money rather than stealing it, so he applied to work at a funeral home. But in hindsight, it's a little concerning that he wanted a job where he would be around dead bodies all day, especially because he had interest in standing over them. I mean, very bizarre. His mother remembers that during this time, Gavin was crying and having a lot of emotional outbursts during the school day. But at night, Gavin was apparently a totally different person, and it was like he was living a different life. He was breaking into people's homes and businesses, climbing on top of different buildings, spray painting various areas like a city park, and in 2016, he ended up actually receiving a felony charge for breaking and entering. Because of this, he had to give a DNA sample to the juvenile court, and this DNA sample was later used to match the DNA found on the glove outside of Margaret's home. Then, in 2016, his grandmother passed away. He also violated his probation during this time, and both of these occurrences caused him to start seeing a therapist again for a little while. Then by January of 2018, he was drinking as much alcohol as he possibly could throughout the day. He was stealing from various places, and a friend told the principal at their school that they were actually worried that Gavin was going to hurt himself. So the principal informed Gavin's mom about this, and this caused Gavin to enter therapy once again. He was given the option to either do therapy or take medication. So he agreed to talk therapy first. However, after speaking with Gavin, the therapist told Gavin's mom that he needed to be on medication immediately. So Gavin started taking Zoloft, which is a medication used to treat a variety of mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. He was initially prescribed 25 milligrams, but this was later increased to 50 milligrams just 5 days later. Then, 2 weeks later, his dosage increased to 75 milligrams. And a few weeks after that, his dosage was increased to 100 milligrams. Now, this is where his dosage stayed for a few months. During this time, Gavin was writing in his journal about his lack of feelings, and he wrote that he felt nothing, and how the fact that he felt nothing really bothered him. He knew that this wasn't a normal way of feeling. And his mom also started noticing that Gavin was increasingly irritable and restless. He was talking much more than usual and often had random large fits of aggression. And by the time he murdered Margaret, his anger and aggression were apparently at an all-time high. So Gavin was charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of aggravated burglary, and 1 count of gross abuse of a corpse. In May of 2018, a preliminary autopsy report indicated that Margaret had contusions on her face and her head, a fracture on her neck vertebrae, and a fracture in one eye socket. This crime was brutal and horrific, and it really ended up affecting the residents of this small town. The town had previously felt like it was a place of safety for residents, but now they couldn't help but look behind their backs and double-check that their doors were locked at night. So Gavin was held in a juvenile detention center, but ended up being tried as an adult. So he was held on a $1 million bond, and his trial date was set for November of 2018. Before trial, his lawyer requested that some of the evidence, including his phone records and items found in his room, shouldn't be allowed to be shown during the trial. However, the judge, Joyce Kimbler, denied this request. But a gag order was put into place at the request of Gavin's lawyer. So Gavin initially pleaded not guilty, but then on November 2nd, just days before his trial date of November 5th, he pleaded no contest. Now, pleading no contest can seem a little bit confusing, but it just means that the person isn't saying that they are guilty or not guilty. The person is just saying that they understand that the court has enough adequate evidence to convict them of the crime. Now, this came as a pretty big surprise, especially because Gavin did not receive any sort of plea deal whatsoever, and you usually see people plead no contest if some sort of deal is involved. Even so, as Gavin was entering his pleas, the judge asked him, "What do you think you did wrong?" And Gavin replied, "I caused the death of Margaret Douglas." His sentencing hearing was set for January 3rd, and the judge ordered that Gavin be moved from the juvenile detention center to the Medina County Jail. At the request of his lawyer, she also ordered Gavin to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Along with pleading no contest, Gavin denied his right to a trial by jury, so the judge lifted the gag order that had previously been put in place because a jury would, of course, no longer be needed.
On behalf of the state of Ohio, do you have any motions at this time?
Here, Your Honor. Thank you. At this time, Your Honor, two motions. One, we request that the defendant be transferred immediately from the juvenile detention facility to be held in the county jail pending finalization and sentencing. And the second, we ask that the court lift the previously imposed gag order.
On behalf of the defendants, do you have any objection to the defendant being transferred to the Medina County Jail at this time?
I do, Your Honor. A revised code says that the detention center is a particular establishment for housing juveniles accused of crime, and that juveniles accused of that crime can be held at the juvenile detention center until such time as they are actually sentenced or disposed of. Because he has not yet been sentenced and will not be sentenced until January 3rd, I would ask the court to allow him to remain in the custody of the Juvenile Detention Center. He's had no problems while being at the detention center. I spoke this morning to the assistant superintendent. They've had no objections with his behavior there, and there's no issue with him continuing to stay there. I would ask that the court allow him to remain there.
I believe that that is up to the discretion of the court. The defendant has now been convicted of these matters. He is no longer accused, so the court will order they be transferred to the Medina jail. Any objection to the lifting of the gag order?
Your Honor, I again, because we have a sentencing hearing and mitigation scheduled for January 3rd, I would ask that the gag order be continued until the case is ultimately disposed of.
Prosecutor Thompson?
Your Honor, the sole purpose that the defense established the gag order under and requested was to protect the potential jury pool. That issue is now behind us. There is no constitutional basis prohibiting the distribution of the information in this matter. Therefore, the gag order has run its usefulness, and we would ask that it be lifted.
The court will lift the gag order at this time, as there is no potential for prejudice to the jury pool in this matter. Anything else at this time on behalf of the state of Ohio?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything else on behalf of the defendant?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
So Gavin's sentencing hearing was set for early January of 2019, and he was facing a minimum sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, and a maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. And because he was under the age of 18, he would not be up for the death penalty. So in January, Gavin's sentencing hearing lasted about 4.5 hours, and the main argument up for debate was whether Gavin could eventually be rehabilitated, and if he should be sentenced to life in prison with or without the possibility of parole. The judge heard testimony from people on both sides of the argument, one being a psychiatrist named Luna Jones, who conducted the court-ordered psychiatric evaluation. She testified that Gavin had numerous disorders, including ADHD, depression, substance abuse issues, a sexual sadism disorder, and a conduct disorder. Now, a sexual sadism disorder meant that he was aroused by performing sexual acts on others without their consent, and a conduct disorder means that he liked to break the rules and act out violently. So paired together, it is a very violent and very dangerous. And the psychiatrist noted that people with these conditions often have very little chance of rehabilitation. She also noted that Gavin seemed to have very little remorse for what he did, and this was evident by his behavior in the courtroom, because he was often just staring off into space, not showing any type of emotion or any sign of remorse. He had a complete disregard for what he did. And another psychiatrist named Lynn Fenton suggested that he actually needed substance abuse counseling, sex offender treatment, and individual counseling. Gavin's mother, Christine, also took the stand during the sentencing hearing. And this was the only time that Gavin showed any emotion during the trial whatsoever. He sat and cried silently as he listened to what his mom had to say. Christine discussed what Gavin had been going through for the past 10 years, and she talked about how he would get into trouble, go to therapy, be put on medication, and this cycle would just happen over and over again. She said that she knew her son caused trouble, but that she and Gavin's father were actively trying to help him get better. They continually sought treatment for Gavin, and if one form of treatment failed, they tried another. In January of 2018, when Gavin was initially prescribed Zoloft, Christine said that she noticed a change in him. He was in a much more irritable mood than normal. He would lash out at people, he would say crazy things, and was overall just a lot more angry. So after Gavin was arrested, Christine started researching Zoloft. And she specifically read a book titled Medication Madness by Dr. Peter Breggin. And she learned that children under the age of 18 should not be taking Zoloft due to the adverse effects in minors, like irritability and aggressiveness. So once Christine learned this, she gave the book to Gavin so that he could read it, and then she immediately took him off the medication. She even contacted the author about possibly speaking at Gavin's trial. Christine stated that if Gavin hadn't been on Zoloft, he probably wouldn't have done what he did. She stated that if she could take anything back, she wouldn't have put her son on the medication at all, and that she felt like everything was her fault.
You can't make me believe that my decision wasn't the ultimate cause of all of this. To simply say I'm sorry to a victim's family, that's not enough. You can't undo their heartache. You can't undo our heartache.
So this Zoloft factor became a major argument for the defense. Dr. Bregan, the author of Medication Madness, agreed to take the stand to corroborate what Christine was saying. He said that when he spoke to Gavin, he asked him how he felt on Zoloft, and Gavin said that the medication didn't make him feel any different. He was constantly high, drunk, or both, so he really didn't feel any effect from the medication. Dr. Bregan would go on to say that Gavin was probably being affected by involuntary intoxication due to the mixture of the drugs that he was consuming. However, the prosecution was not buying this defense, and they stressed that Gavin had been undergoing treatment for many years and still escalated his behavior, even before obtaining the Zoloft prescription. They argued that Gavin being on Zoloft didn't matter, and that he probably still would have committed the crime. Gavin had also been writing in his journal about his desire to kill before he was even prescribed this medication. They also noted that Gavin was in enough control during the crime that he barely left any evidence at the scene. So if this crime was committed by someone being seriously affected by drugs, they likely would not have left the crime scene so pristine and clean. So Cindy and her daughter Patricia also took the stand, and they spoke about Margaret and just what a truly great person she was to her friends, her family, and her community. They spoke about how everyone knew that she was about to turn 100 years old and how she couldn't wait, they couldn't wait, everybody was so excited.
She loved being alive. She often talked that she just couldn't wait until she turned 100.
They also talked about how independent Margaret was and that she had lived in that home for 70 years, 20 of which she lived alone. They discussed how even though Margaret was 98 years old, she was strong and she was a fighter, and it wouldn't have been easy to kill her. Patricia specifically spoke about how her life has drastically changed and how she can't sleep peacefully at night at all anymore. She's constantly looking behind her back, double-checking that her doors are locked, and she even purchased a gun to keep by her bedside for her own safety. Not only was her great-aunt murdered, but the aftermath has drastically affected their entire family. She believes that Gavin is a dangerous person and would likely commit a similar crime again if he were ever released.
He broke into her house, watched her sleeping, and took videos of her sleeping. He then held her against her will, hit her, and strangled her. And I believe that he planned to kill numerous people and used my aunt as a warm-up, so to speak, for those other killings.
So towards the end of the trial, Gavin commented, "I don't know how to explain how this happened. I don't think there is an explanation. I would take it back in a heartbeat if I could. I feel terrible for what I've done, and I'm sorry for what I did. I constantly live in regret and shame because of it."
I wrote this down because I knew I wouldn't know what to say on the spot. I don't know how to explain why all this happened. I don't think there really is an explanation to begin with. I think about it all the time. And I would take it back in a heartbeat if I could. I feel terrible for what I've done. And I will never do anything like that again. I'm so sorry for what I did. I constantly live in regret and shame because of it. I wish I had the words to express how sorry I really am.
Thank you.
However, the judge believed that Gavin was not fit to enter back into society. She felt Gavin's crimes were especially deplorable and that he showed no real signs of remorse, and strongly believed that Gavin had little chance of rehabilitation. So Gavin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for aggravated murder. Additionally, he received 10 years for aggravated burglary, 10 years for kidnapping, and 1 year for abuse of a corpse. Now, unsurprisingly, just 1 month after his sentencing, in February of 2019, Gavin's team appealed the sentence. They had two main reasons for doing so. First, they felt that the court did not take into account his age when they sentenced him to life without parole. They felt this was excessive, especially because in their opinion, Gavin had the chance for rehabilitation. Second, they felt that the other charges of burglary, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse should have been merged with the aggravated murder charge. But in March of 2019, a judge struck down this appeal and upheld the original sentence. So Gavin would continue with his original sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Or so it seemed. Shortly after his sentencing, a bill was introduced to the Ohio Supreme Court that would potentially end life sentences for those who committed crimes under the age of 18. Senate Bill 256 states that anyone under the age of 18 who has committed a violent act could be up for parole after 25 to 30 years. The law would also be retroactive. So even people who are in their 50s and 60s and beyond could be up for parole if they committed their crime before they were 18. If parole is denied, the person charged will have another parole hearing in 5 years. The bill essentially eradicates the possibility for children to be charged with life without parole. Now, supporters of this bill said that not offering child offenders the opportunity to rehabilitate and be released is archaic, is cruel, and unusual punishment. They argued that Ohio was one of the few places that still allowed this. So the introduction of this bill shocked many, including Margaret's family. Margaret's great-niece Patricia became very vocal about her family's opposition to the bill. She worries that when the parole board is viewing Gavin's case, they will only look at the charges and not the gruesome details of the crime.
It takes out of account the fact that he strangled her with his hands, that he punched her in the face, that he disrobed, that he sexually assaulted her dead body.
Patricia stated that her family will live in constant fear that Gavin has the possibility of being released. And they were initially given closure, but if the bill is passed, that closure and the sense of safety will be gone. Now, Gavin's case was specifically mentioned to the Senate Judiciary Committee and the House Criminal Justice Committee as a reason why this bill should not be passed. But Margaret's family, along with many others, were never even given the opportunity to argue their stance against SB 255 in person. Therefore, on January 9th, 2021, the bill was approved, and it was signed by the governor of Ohio. This means that in 2043, 25 years after brutally killing Margaret, Gavin will face a parole board and could potentially be released. Margaret's family is terrified of this outcome and has claimed that they will appear at every single parole hearing of Gavin's to ensure that he is never released. The murder of Margaret Douglas was an absolutely horrifying and senseless tragedy, and the way that Gavin violated her is just sick beyond comprehension. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that Margaret would have made it to 100 years old, but that chance was ripped away from her by someone who was just seeking a thrill, an adrenaline rush. Seeing such a long and full life be so callously snuffed out reminds us of the disregard that some people have for the value of human life. But I am curious to hear your thoughts on this because I'm wondering, do you think that the bill outlawing life without parole for minors and other laws like it are fair? Or do you think that they will threaten more lives and do more harm than good? I'd also love to know your thoughts on if Gavin's actions were a result of his medication. There is a lot of research on medications like Zoloft negatively affecting underage individuals, but was that a factor here? I feel like a lot of times people use these arguments to try to bolster their defense, but is there something credible here? Let me know your thoughts down below and tell me what you think about this case. It is a brutal and disgusting and heartbreaking one. So until the next one, guys, please, please, please stay safe. All right, take care. Bye.